What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be diving into the most popular cards from Phyrexia all be one. Now that we're about a week in, we have enough data to kind of figure out what cards are the most played when it comes to the new set, and it actually kind of shows what kind of way the standard meta is going overall when it comes to what colors are the most popular. With that being said, let's just dive into the cards and let's just start talking about them. And the first card up on the list is going to be Darkslick Shores, and it makes sense. Darkslick Shores makes an appearance here in the top 10 when it comes to the most popular cards from the set, and that's just because Esper Control, mid-range, and even Dimir Control are pretty popular deck lists, even before Phyrexia all be one. And having a land that comes into the battlefield untapped in the first couple turns of the game is definitely effective, and without taking damage is also pretty good against especially aggressive matchups. And overall, it makes sense as those decks were still pretty prominent in the meta that this land kind of slides in and makes it into the top 10 most popular cards in the set. The next card up on the list following Darkslick Shores is going to be Mirrex. It is another land. I actually think this is probably one of the better lands from the set, as it is a land that creates colorless. It can create any mana of any color the turn it comes into the battlefield, and it also has a mana sink ability to tap in 3 mana and tap in to create the 1/1 Phyrexian Might creature token with Toxic 1. And I think that's kind of like how it makes it versatile, because it can fit in a lot of deck archetypes. It can fit in a control deck where maybe you just want to have something to sink mana into. It can fit in a tokens deck because it creates tokens by itself. It can even fit in some mid-range decks that just want to do something with mana as well. And this is definitely one of the ways of creating pressure on the battlefield by adding more tokens on the battlefield. And I do think that's kind of why this card is seeing a lot of play in across various decks throughout the format. And it definitely makes sense to see why it's in the top 10. Moving on to number 8, we have Drowning the Ichor, and this one kind of surprises me, as typically 2 mana sorcery speed removal spells aren't very effective, but I do think with a lot of decks looking around playing the Proliferate ability makes this card pretty effective even at sorcery speed. Also, the fact that -4/-4 is definitely very good for 2 mana, as a lot of the early drop creatures in the format definitely don't have more than 4 toughness, and it also gets around things that would give target creature indestructible, making this a pretty effective removal spell. So I do see why this card is added in a couple decks depending on what type of deck strategy you are trying to do, and overall makes it a pretty effective card in the format. And the first Planeswalker to make the list is going to be the Eternal Wanderer. This one is overall a very good Planeswalker, I think, especially for control decks, even token decks, as I do think it's a Planeswalker that does a lot when it comes out into the battlefield. It's also a hard Planeswalker to deal with without direct removal, because it can't be attacked down by more than one creature. You can +1 it and exile up to 1 target artifact or creature, and that artifact or creature comes back onto the battlefield at the end of that player's end step. So it's pretty effective to maybe turn off a particular card you don't want your opponent to have on the battlefield or be able to use during their turn. You can 0 it to get a 2/2 Samurai creature token that has double strike, which makes it pretty good overall as a blocker to put it in the way of protecting the Wanderer. And then -4, you can make each player choose a creature they control, and then depending on what creature they control, the rest of the creatures are sacrificed, which makes it overall pretty decent in the fact that it is a board wipe built into it. So definitely an overall very, very good Planeswalker, and definitely a Planeswalker you'll probably see in a lot of control decks in the format. Moving on, the next card we got is Experimental Augury, and this is not surprising this card's on this list, as I think this is probably a really, really strong common compared to a lot of the other commons in the set. It is a 2 mana, look at top 3, get to choose 1 card from that top 3, add it to your hand, put the rest on the bottom in any order, and then you proliferate. And I do think that's actually the key word here, and is the proliferate, just because it is a pretty effective ability. It's good in poison decks, it's good in decks that contain things that have counters on it, like Planeswalkers, maybe a Bank Buster. Overall, it's a very strong card, especially for it being an instant speed common. I do think this is a card you'll see in a lot of control decks, just because of how effective it can be about finding maybe an answer. And on top of that, putting counters on things like Planeswalkers to maybe keep the control going overall in the matchup. Moving on, we have Bloated Contaminator, and this card kind of surprises me that it's this popular, but looking at the most popular decks of the format, this makes a lot of sense just because of how effective it is in a lot of decks that are trying to play around the Toxic ability, as it is a solid 3-drop that is a 4/4. It has Trample, it has Toxic 1, and then whenever it deals damage to a player, you get to Proliferate, which makes this an overall pretty effective card in those said decks, just because even if your opponents throw something in front of it, if it doesn't absorb all the damage that this creature does, you're going to be able to get that 1 Toxic on them, and on top of that, Proliferate that 1 Toxic. So basically, it gives your opponent 2 poison just from this 1 card. And I think that what makes this card super effective, especially in a lot of the decks that want to run it, that want to play poison. Overall, very interesting card nonetheless, and definitely will be one of those things we'll continue to see play as we move on. Moving on to the next card on this list, that card being Venerated Rotpriest. This card has been talked about, I think, ever since people saw it in action. This card's really good for being a 1-mana 1/2. It fits in a lot of shells that really want to focus on toxic or spells that target creatures you control to give your opponent additional toxic. I think this card performs really well in the Golgari fight deck and also the Selesnya toxic deck, though I would say there are people who probably enjoy the Simic toxic deck, though I don't think that deck is as effective as the other two, just because I feel like sometimes it is a coin flip whether or not you're going to combo off and finish off your opponent with poison, as it doesn't have any other alternate win conditions really, because it doesn't put a lot of pressure on your opponent's life total. But overall, this card is very good and definitely makes sense as to why it sees a lot of play. Moving into the top 3, we got our first Mythic on the list, that card being Phyrexian Obliterator. I think the reason why this card is as popular as it is, one, it fits in a lot of strong decks that already exist in the format. Also, it's another card that is a reprint, and a lot of people get excited, especially if they played this card in the past, to play it again. It's definitely a good card. It's a card that for 4 mana is a 5/5 that has trample, and whenever a source would deal damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents, so it's definitely very hard to block and get rid of off the battlefield without any sort of direct removal, making this card overall super good and very effective, especially in a more aggressive matchup. Moving on from Obliterator, the next card we have is Vraska Betrayer Sting. This is actually surprising just because I wasn't expecting Vraska to be as high as she is on this list, but I do see why, as she's kind of one of those planeswalkers that works very well with other planeswalkers because of her 0 ability of being able to draw a card and lose a life and being able to proliferate. She's also very good in decks that want to put additional poison on things or additional counters on other things like bank busters and things like that. Her -2 is also very effective because it turns target creature just into a treasure and loses all its abilities. And the -9 is also great because if you can get to that point, you probably grinded out the game far enough. If your opponent has less than 9 poison counters, they gain the number of poison counters equal to the difference. So basically, they go up to 9 poison. Overall, making Vraska a pretty strong planeswalker in general, and the fact that she can be cheated out for 5 mana is definitely very good as well. And the final card on this list is going to be Sheoldred's Edict. This card is definitely very strong, I think, for 2 mana, being an instant speed, making your opponent sacrifice something, depending on what you choose. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, each opponent sacrifices a creature token, or each opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. And I think the ability of being able to choose for only 2 mana instant speed makes this card super strong. It's definitely something you're probably going to play a couple copies of in your deck if you're splashing black, just because of how effective it can be, as it does answer a lot of what your opponent may be doing, especially in the early game or in the late game if they do play planeswalkers, making this card super effective in that way, and definitely makes sense as to why this deck is as popular as it is, as black being one of the better colors. A lot of decks just want to splash this because it's just more pressure on your opponent's creatures and their board overall, and with it being as cheap as it is, makes it pretty effective. And those are the top 10 cards currently in the new set. Overall, each of these cards brings something unique to the format. Overall, it is not surprising that Mono Black has the most representation on this list, just because it is a stronger color. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. What card stands out to you? Is there a card that I may have not went over on this list that you're surprised didn't make the list? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video. If you're liking the content on the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It definitely helps out a lot. Also, if you want to go the extra mile, you can simply click the join button. You can join the channel and become a member for as little as $1. That will also help support the channel.